Last year, there was an embryo thawed successfully resulted in a live birth, I think 25 years after it was frozen.
You can freeze the embryo for 25 years.
Agony, especially as a woman, right, of going through that treatment and then perhaps not becoming pregnant. And then you're just supposed to show up at work like nothing happened.
A lot of the stuff that we would fear about embryo selection is actually not genetically determinable. If your parents are tall, you're probably going to be tall. My kids are never going to be basketball players. Like,
how do you start a business like that?
The success rate of IVF in the US is much higher than it is in the UK and Europe.
Keep trying and keep transferring. At some point it will work. The emotional experience, as Jeremy mentioned, of that is really challenging.
Unfortunately, because people who are trying to have babies are desperate to have babies, there is a lot of snake oil.
The genetic testing we're talking about that improves the likelihood of that successful transfer, often not covered by insurance.
Even in Canada?
Especially in Canada.
Today I sat down with the CEO and CPO of Juniper Genomics. We talked about how do you build a sophisticated biotech business in IVF space. We also discussed all things in vitro fertilization. Stick around if you want to know how do you build a biotech business in IVF space. I think at some point humans will have to evolve what we do, right? We have to leave that nostalgic feeling that I like running experiments, right? At some point we have to say we had fun, but now it's time to move on. Right now, time to just manage these AI agents. Does it make sense? So,
well, the things that are truly repetitive, right, are the perfect things to offload and not do yourself, right? If you're doing the same thing over and over and over, that's not the best use of a human's time.
Right.
Right. I mean, in IVF, the concept comes up all the time of practicing at the top of your license, right? At the top of your capabilities, right? The most, like, you're going to be able to run an IVF clinic most efficiently, right? If everyone from your embryologist to your lab manager to your reception staff to your nurse managers are working at the top of their practice. That means that the REI is working at the top of their practice and is doing the things that only the reproductive endocrinologist can do. Right. And then you're seeing more patients more efficiently at lower cost, and you can improve access to infertility services. And like that's really the key. So there's companies that are upskilling OBGs now, right? That their goal is to, allow more IVF cycles to be done, more of the IVF cycle to be done by an OBG or under the supervision of an OBG and themselves under the supervision of an REI. Right?
No, totally.
Yeah.
I think the goal is, can we empower every team member, whether it's a biotech company or clinical trial or diagnostic labs or tech company, can we empower one team member to do the job of 100 people, right? By giving them access to world-class experts, more AI experts. I mean, I'm saying more AI agents as experts, not humans. And then who can work with human individual to automate all of their repetitive work, but at the same time provide expert guidance on everything, right? So that's the goal and that's the future. We're already seeing some movement. We are working with many AI biotechs, but still in very early stages. It will be a very exciting time in 10 years to see how we fully integrate AI to all the things we do. ChatGPT is still very disconnected, right? But AI will become powerful when it moves with us, when it thinks with us, when it does things with us. If I'm running experiment, I'm talking and getting advice, getting feedback in real time. I'm receiving feedback that, hey, this can fail because a molarity is not consistent or your reagent is not consistent. So super exciting time. Sorry, I got distracted with AI, but
no. I mean, it's an interesting conversation, and I think you have to be thinking about it. I think it is a. If you're a startup and you're not deeply thinking about how you use AI and how AI is going to change the parts of the world that you're affiliated with and working with, you're going to miss massive opportunities. You're probably going to get left behind at this point.
No, 100%. If you see last 100 years, we figured out how to create machines to do some job for us. Then after creating machines, we thought the only way to come closer is we become more machine, right? But now we realize it's the other way around. We created machine. Now we have to find a way how to make them like us, right? So that's what AI is doing, to more humanizing machines. So we can really become like a team player rather than you just have something totally disconnected. You will use it when you need help. But now it is becoming more like companion. And AI is helping as the interface, right? So it's more smart. It understands you. You don't have to write line of code to tell what you need. You can just speak human language. If you speak Hindi, you can speak Hindi. If you speak English, you can speak in English and say, that's what I need. And then it will make sure machine understands what you're saying. So I think it's amazing interface between human and
Are you polite
machine.
to it when you type?
What's that?
Are you?
Oh, polite.
I am.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
You're Canadian, of course you are.
I mean, of course, right. But
I mean, I used to write like orders, but then I realized like when AI has bodies, so you don't know how they will respond to it, right? Currently, they don't have bodies, so I'm safe. These are just line of codes sitting somewhere. But when they are connected with robotics, they will remember everything.
they've got all the data. It's like, it's that
this
guy.
I was telling this to one of my colleagues the other day. Man, AI knows so many dirty secrets. I'm saying dirty meaning I speak my mind when I'm speaking with AI.
Right.
So we don't know what level of power they will have. So I'm a little bit concerned, but I'm also optimistic.
So now you started being polite.
I say it's too late for you now. Sorry, you got off on the wrong foot.
No, I hope.
They're going to hear this, and you've undone all your hard work.
Yeah. At least I'm trying, right? So they will
Exactly.
these AI overlords.
So you won't be first.
I won't be first. They will give me some benefit of doubt, but anyway. Enough about AI. Would love to know more about you. It would be cool if both of you gave like introduction. I know now Jeremy for last many years. Every time I come to Toronto, would love to do like coffee or drink. And every time I meet Jeremy, I learn something new. Very thoughtful. So I was like, let's do a podcast together. So Jeremy, if you don't mind doing like a quick intro, telling who you are, what you do.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm Jeremy. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Juniper Genomics. We're using genomics to help IVF patients have a faster and more successful journey to parenthood.
When did you start the company?
In a way, a long, long time ago. I've been thinking about this idea since I was in grad school, which is like an uncountable number of years ago. But I was working in meiosis in yeast, but that's like the one of the most sort of basic organisms that has different gametes.
Right.
There's A and alpha, and so they undergo meiosis, which is the process by which you turn regular cells in your body into germ cells,
right.
Sperm and egg in the case of humans. But that process is kind of conserved from yeast all the way up to humans. So I was studying meiosis and sexual reproduction in that context, and it was the beginning of the human genome era. The yeast genome had recently been sequenced, so like I was working in a model where I had a sense of what that was going to mean for humans as well in the future, and that was so. I mean, it was the 90s. It was like as IVF was really becoming more common and popularized, and that understanding that we were entering this genomics era, and that there was this technology that allowed you to create a set of embryos. Seemed really obvious to me from the beginning that those two things had to go together, because you have this moment with a set of embryos where everything that's genetically knowable about the future of that human, and genetically knowable is a big caveat, right? Like there's lots of stuff that isn't genetics at all, but everything genetically determinable can be known in that moment, and then you could choose this embryo or that embryo. And that ability to use that choice to change the journey of your family, to avoid genetic disease, to just successfully have a baby,
Right.
and that is really what's the opportunity to help IVF patients and clinicians today is that so much of the reproductive journey is actually determined by the genetics of the embryo itself. So like the opportunity to use that data in that moment when it's highly actionable, the opportunity to just pick a different embryo is like kind of astonishing.
Right.
And I think actually a transformational moment for humans, but really a transformational moment. It should be an empowering moment for IVF patients. And right now they're getting so little of that data and so little information about how to use that data that I think there's a real gap that we can.
Sure. I have so many questions, but I want to give you a chance to introduce as well. I should have asked you before, but that's okay. How do you pronounce your name?
Kaylene.
Kaylene? Okay. Kaylene, great to have you on the show as well. Do you want to give a quick introduction?
So I joined Juniper Genomics and Jeremy about 2 months ago, but have worked in genetics for going on 2 decades. Initially trained as a genetic counselor. If you're not familiar with what a genetic counselor is, they are master's trained individuals that learn about medical genetics, but also about counseling. So we were talking about like therapy earlier and the human aspect of, working in healthcare. And I think genetic counselors really embody that place in healthcare of bringing medicine, but also that personal touch and helping families understand their genetics, what it might mean for themselves and their family and their treatment, et cetera. Do they want genetic testing? Do they not want genetic testing? And I loved working in clinic. I worked in clinic for about 5 years.
Right.
And really enjoyed my patients, but was frustrated with the pace of working in a large healthcare system. And I had the opportunity to join a startup, and I did, and I fell in love and have not looked back. And so Juniper is my 4th startup and have really enjoyed bringing new technology to the forefront to impact patients' lives. I just feel like my impact is so much larger working at a startup.
Yeah. No, like we were talking before we started recording, once you go startup, you never go back because it's so addictive in a way because it accelerates your learning, it accelerates your aging, surprisingly. But it also...
Aging backwards.
Yeah.
In spirit.
That's right.
Yeah, my co-founder was telling me, hey, I'm going to start doing some anti-aging thing. I was like, you need it, man. He looks younger. Maybe it's working. So... but yeah, I think startup, the good thing about startup is you get to see the impact very fast.
Yes.
Right? So in bigger companies, what I noticed is people spend more time convincing others, right? Playing that more diplomatic role. In startup, there's no diplomacy. Sometimes it's radical candor. You realize the gap, you fill the gap. Yes. And you don't wait for orders, right? That's the ideal startup team member profile, right? So you expect people to come in, identify the gap, and fill it, right? Not waiting for orders. And that makes startups very special. And
sorry, I'm just imagining you waiting for orders.
No, you have to have a bias for action.
or me. Yeah, bias for action, right?
You're
That's the
waiting.
startup. Yeah, right. Like either of us, like, or even perceiving that one had been attempted.
No.
Well, I think, in a large system where you are doing the diplomacy, the amount of time in some cases that takes, your startup would be over. You'd run out of money. There'd be nothing left. So you just have to act, and you're right, fill in those gaps as best you can, which not everybody loves.
Yeah.
You have to be really comfortable with being uncomfortable.
That's a great way to put it because, there is comfort working for a bigger machine too, if you like more certainty, right? And startup, there's so much, like it's all uncertainty, right? You don't know what's going to happen. There's always risk of dying, right? Irrespective of how mature the startup is. So that makes you smarter. That makes you prioritize things smartly, I would say.
Yeah. So pretty early in my startup journey. So like I left grad school, I went to law school, I practiced law for a decade, which is kind of the opposite of a startup in a lot of ways.
Right.
I mean, there's a lot of independence in the practice of law, even if you're at a big firm, but it's still like, it's pretty institutional and it's pretty low risk. And I'm a partner in my law firm. And I'm like, I can't do this for another decade. And I went and joined one of my clients that was a biotech company. But like pretty early in that stage of my journey, I met Michael Gilman. Have you ever met him in Boston?
Yeah.
Yeah. He's a Canadian expat in Boston. He got involved with, what's the venture fund? Atlas?
I don't remember.
I think. But he was at Biogen. His first company, his first startup, he led a team out of Biogen that took an asset out of Biogen, developed it for 2 years and sold it back to Biogen at like a massive return. And you know, you would say like, you know, people looked at us like, what, like, why didn't Biogen just do this, right? Like, and the answer is that what he calls it is like the existential challenge as a startup. Like if Biogen doesn't develop that drug, they have like 17 other drugs, and that's their job at Biogen is to say, you know, which of these drugs is the most important, deserves, you know, the most resources right now, merits, you know, has the greatest probability of success, and like, you know, 87% wins out over 86%. Right. But if you've taken one asset out of that environment and your whole existence depends on the success of that asset moving through clinical development, yeah, you're gonna dedicate resources to it, you know, mentally, emotionally, financially. That isn't going to happen in any other environment. So I think, you know, the power of the startup is that taking on that existential challenge, right? Of like, you know, we are going to use genomics to help improve IVF outcomes, right? And that's powerful. Like it's powerful in terms of the way you spend your time during the day. It's powerful in the way it like sort of occupies your mind. And it's powerful in the story that you get to tell, and you get to bring like amazing people along for the journey because you're doing this really cool, singular, new, awesome thing.
No, totally. I think you have to live and breathe that, and especially when you always have a risk of dying or explode, right? You see both things together because you know this is going to work, and it can be huge. It can impact millions of lives if it works in your case, especially. So you are excited about that, and you cannot afford doing 10 other things. So you always have to come back, focus, really understand what's the DNA of the company, what's the mission and vision of the company, and then align all the resources, right? Even find people who will align with the vision of the company. Because if you hire people, they don't believe in the startup, it's very hard to grow and create something massive.
Yeah. I think my favorite part about what we're doing and why I joined was that it is really focused on outcomes. It's not like a vanity project. It's really very focused on how do we make this experience better for couples who are experiencing infertility, which is hard, right? You've wanted a child, you've tried to have a child, maybe that's not going the way you expected. Maybe you've had losses, and the idea that we could reduce the time that it takes to get pregnant and maybe avoid losses, I think is what really resonated with me. It's not just genetics like for fun, right? We're not choosing blue-eyed children. It's really about having a better outcome.
When you say better outcome is basically, so it's more like disease, more like genetic disposition for some genetic disease.
Interestingly, I feel like that's a secondary
goal. So that's what I thought, right? Okay. That's what I thought in the lab, 30 years ago. That's what I thought when we started Juniper a few years ago. And as we started talking to people on the IVF journey and IVF clinicians, so here's an interesting piece of it, right? Most people encounter with their reproductive endocrinologist, their IVF clinician, stops after a heartbeat is detected during pregnancy. They move back to their OBG for the rest of the pregnancy, and then they're with their OBG for
What's OBG?
Obstetrician gynecologist.
Okay.
Right? So they're regular sort of maternal health clinician, right? They're not with the infertility specialist anymore. So the infertility specialist generally hands off patients once a successful pregnancy has been achieved. So they report live birth outcomes to a central database in the U.S. and Canada, but they're not generally with the patient through that whole journey. Their journey with the patient stops once they've achieved a successful pregnancy. So from the IVF clinician's point of view, like they've succeeded when they have a pregnancy and they've handed that patient back to their OBG, right? And so they're literally, they literally kind of lose that connection with the patient when they've made that handoff. So the idea of like something that happens after birth, like the risk of a developmental disorder, childhood disease, which are like massively genetic, right? It's now, exome sequencing, whole genome sequencing is first line of diagnostics at a high-end center for all of those kinds of childhood disorders. But it's so far beyond what the REI's journey is, what the infertility journey is. And so that journey in which you're producing a set of embryos, and it's the same for the patients, right? They're there because they've been trying to get pregnant and they have not been able to add a child to their family, right? Sometimes they don't have a child yet. Sometimes they've had a child and then having another child, secondary infertility is much harder. Sometimes just structurally they can't, like my sister and her wife, right? And they still had to sign the form, in Quebec saying, oh yeah, we've been trying for 6 months, right? But their medical intervention is infertility treatment, right? It's the same technology, the assisted reproductive technology for same-sex couples, for single parents by choice. All those people they're there to have a child.
Makes sense. If you don't mind dumbing it down a little bit, so who is your potential or ideal beneficiary? And what is that journey? Is it people who have frozen embryos? Is it people from like same-sex marriages? Is it like, who is this ideal persona? And what is the typical journey right now? And how do you plan to transform it? Or how are you transforming it?
Yeah.
So the ideal couple is really anybody who might be pursuing IVF for any reason. And IVF is when you are taking an egg and a sperm and making an embryo outside of the body. But often these couples are going through quite a journey before that time, either because maybe you're a same-sex couple and you're then deciding to have children and pursuing donors, or because if you're a heterosexual couple and you've been trying to have a baby, you typically in the US are waiting a year before you get referred to an infertility specialist. And then when you're there, you're going to go through a bunch of tests and you may undergo other infertility treatments before you reach the stage where you're offered IVF. So it really can be a very long and stressful journey. Some couples may also end up in infertility because they were able to get pregnant on their own, but they've experienced multiple losses, and there's not an explanation for that. So it really is, it's not like you just wake up one day and you're like, aha, I'm going to go see the infertility specialist. It really is sort of a long process. And, unfortunately, during that time, women are getting older, and as you get older, there are increased chances for genetic abnormalities in the child, same actually for fathers. And so that time matters a lot. And so the ability to bring IVF into the picture perhaps sooner and have a successful outcome sooner is really appealing, not only for the provider, but for the patients. And I think ultimately our hope is if we can be really successful, then does IVF become an option sooner in that journey?
I see. And when you say sooner, how soon? Is it when the embryo is ready or frozen? Is it when there is IVF process?
Right. So during the IVF process, the overall journey of like once you're in that moment, right? You have your egg and your sperm. Sometimes that's the intended parent. Sometimes it's a donor. But either way, you've got biological components, egg and sperm, right? They get combined, and you don't just do one at a time, right? You fertilize as many eggs as are available, right? So you'll fertilize, 15, 20 eggs, and then there's attrition. Some of them don't get fertilized successfully, some of them don't grow successfully. By the time you get to about 5 or 6 days, the successfully fertilized embryos have formed what's called a blastocyst. So you've got sort of a ball of 200 or 300 cells. Right. The outside of that ball becomes the placenta. The inside, the inner cell mass, becomes the fetus, the embryo, eventually the child. And so you'll end up with typically 4 to 5 blastocysts. And you don't. We used to, and in our sort of cohort, right? You probably know IVF twins or even triplets, right? Because in the older days of IVF, you would transfer multiple embryos at a time. Right? It's risky for the mom. It's risky for the developing. It's risky for the developing embryos, and so we don't do that anymore. Mainly because IVF scientists in the lab figured out a way to vitrify embryos. So now you don't. So you get like 5 embryos and you transfer them all because you had no way to store them. So now, as you alluded to, right, you can freeze embryos, you can freeze eggs, you can freeze sperm, you can freeze embryos, and they can remain viable in that vitrified frozen state. And it's not just like in your freezer, it's in liquid nitrogen, right, at minus 200 and something degrees, right? And last year, there was an embryo thawed successfully resulted in a live birth, I think 25 years after it was frozen.
Wow.
So the ability to, so once now that we can do that vitrification process, now, so you get 5 embryos, they all get frozen, right? And you transfer one at a time. And so now the challenge becomes, which one do you transfer, right? Because if you're a heterosexual couple trying naturally to get pregnant, right? You try to get pregnant in a cycle, maybe it grew for a couple of days, but then it didn't. The woman will have her period on the normal schedule. Like, you wouldn't even know that happened, right? You wouldn't know that there was something growing for 2 days and it failed, right? But with IVF, every single time you've tried a transfer. And that the emotional journey of that in IVF, it's like there's a hashtag for it. It's like hashtag TWW, the 2-week wait, right? This 2 weeks between when you've transferred an embryo and when you can take a pregnancy test, right? And see, was that embryo transfer, was that embryo viable, was the transfer successful, right? And the language around this is so problematic, right? Was the transfer successful? It actually turns out that, and what we've learned and why Juniper, I think is going to be really transformational for families, is that at least 85% of the time an embryo doesn't succeed. It's the genetics of the embryo itself. It wasn't that the doctor did the transfer wrong. It wasn't that your endometrial lining wasn't ready. It wasn't that you drank too many cups of coffee or you took the wrong prenatal vitamins or you have a hostile fucking womb, whatever that means, right? The social excuses that we make up to explain the absence of data. But as we gather more data about IVF failure and pregnancy loss, we realize more and more and more that it's the genetics of the embryo itself. And so what Juniper offers is the opportunity to choose a viable embryo the first time, right? If there's a viable embryo in that set of embryos that you've produced, you know which one it is much more accurately than current testing is able to predict. And so that means that you have a much higher chance of your first transfer being successful. You have a lower chance of transfers not being successful, of that sort of 2-week wait ending in disappointment. You have a lower chance of pregnancy loss after a successful transfer. Every step of the pregnancy journey becomes less risky if you have an embryo that's been screened for the genetics that cause pregnancy loss and IVF failure. And so that's really what we're offering to patients, and that's why that moment of the journey is so critical.
That's very impressive.
Well, and I was going to add, I think the stats are really important here and what kind of blew me away. So if you do no genetic testing on those embryos, you just transfer them based on how they look, essentially. The likelihood of getting pregnant is about 30-35% with the transfer.
30-35%.
Yep.
So like 60-70% of them are failing.
Wow.
And then if you do kind of what is considered, quote unquote, traditional, about half of clinics do some genetic testing on embryos these days. You can increase that to about a coin flip, it's 55%. We are predicting with our testing, we'll bring it up to 85%.
Wow.
So it's a significant difference, right? Moving from that coin flip up to a much higher likelihood that you will have a successful first transfer.
So before Juniper, they basically check chromosomal abnormalities, but also you said by how they look, do they take like images and analyze?
Yeah, so you can look at it under the microscope and do like embryo grading, essentially.
Very impressive.
Yeah. So I mean, that's been that visual analysis of embryos is sort of the baseline of it has been the baseline of embryo selection for a long time, right? Embryologist looks under the microscope. This one is the roundest and prettiest, and it correlates with success to a certain extent, but there's a significant number, right? Even the highest grade embryos, right? 60, 70% of them fail, the roundest and prettiest embryos, right? And the whatever the opposite of roundest and prettiest is, the other end of the scale, right? Those embryos, 15, 20% of those can succeed. So there's a correlation, but it's not perfect, right? If you use that morphology, you're going to discard some viable embryos, you're going to transfer a lot of non-viable embryos. And of course, AI can help with that, right? And so there's probably like 500 companies that are using some form of, stored image analysis, or like either like, a series of images or actual video capture of embryo development to try to correlate morphology ultimately with embryo success. But the challenge is, and what we learned from genetics is, and aneuploidy, the current chromosome testing is the next level of that, right? It's a great start. It improves from 35 to 50%. It accounts for a significant chunk of pregnancy loss. But there's no other area of genetics where you just stop at chromosome counting, right? If God forbid your kid is in the NICU, or you come to a genetics clinic for testing or carrier screening, any of the other clinical genetics encounters that we have, we do whole exome or whole genome sequencing. So right, you have 46 chromosomes, you have 3 billion DNA data pieces, base pairs in those 46 chromosomes, right? And so that's the difference between like 46 and 3 billion is the amount of data that we're adding into that process. And in those 3 billion base pairs, those errors account for 50% of the failures at least, right? So you're accounting for this big additional chunk of IVF failure and pregnancy loss.
Love it. I do want to dig deep on the technology and how is it different. But before that, you mentioned that you can freeze the embryo for 25 years and bring that to life.
Yeah. No, so I mean, once it's vitrified, if it's stored stably in liquid nitrogen, that preservation, like removing it from liquid nitrogen the next month for a transfer, is the same basically as removing it the next year. I mean, we don't have a lot of long-term statistics on the storage, but it's very stable for a very long time.
So keep this embryo viable, like you just have to keep changing liquid nitrogen, or?
I mean, you just maintain it in liquid nitrogen,
frozen,
right?
yeah.
So, I mean, the nature of liquid nitrogen tanks is that some of it evaporates all the time.
Does the baby has more wisdom where it comes as a bad joke? It's frozen for 25
I wish.
years.
Do they sleep better? No.
Baby will come back with all the philosophical and
Right.
will have old soul for sure.
They speak with a Shakespearean accent. I don't know.
We were joking about that. Like, if we could just look at the genetics of like sleep, like which embryo is most likely to result in a child who will sleep through the night. I think we also be onto something, but that we don't have that.
No, because it's probably not genetic, right? It's like and that's so. One of our co-founders is a bioethicist by training, and we think about the ethics of embryo selection a lot.
Yeah.
But it's also an area where just the facts of science help, right? And a lot of the stuff that we would fear about embryo selection is actually not genetically determinable at all. So, I mean, even something like height, right? There's an Israeli study where they looked at large sibling groups, right? And they said, if we look in retrospect at these large sibling groups and we give them a genetic score for height, right? Does the tallest sibling match the highest genetic score for height? And they only do 60% of the time, right? So like even the genetics of height, that's something that has a genetic component, right? If your parents are tall, you're probably going to be tall. My kids are never going to be basketball players. Like there is a genetic component of height, but the parts that we can measure don't guarantee the outcome of any individual. So like a lot of the things that we fear are just not scientifically possible, right? If you want a tall kid, marry a tall person, pick a tall sperm donor. And like, we have no moral problem with somebody marrying somebody tall or picking a tall sperm donor, like all those things, and that's why individual choice is at the core of Juniper's ethics and at the core of all medical bioethics. Autonomy is like the first principle of medical bioethics, that individual people should get to make their own informed choices about every medical encounter, but especially about reproduction choice, right? And so we don't object to any of those choices. But also at Juniper, the science doesn't support using genetics for those choices. We can't make you a baby that sleeps better, or one that's taller, or the one that has an eye color or hair color. So, and we don't want to. We really want to focus on the success of the IVF journey itself.
Sure, but how do you? It's a challenging problem. How do you define what is ethical? Because even ethical norms keep changing over time.
Right.
Like 50 years ago, things we thought were ethical, now you will get cancelled for those things. So how do you define what is ethical when it comes to, embryo selection, it has positive impact to the whole human race. But when you make decision, what type of things you consider ethical, unethical, what guidelines you rely on?
Sure. So let me take a first run at this, and then you can jump in. But so to answer your last question most directly first, right? For the last 70 years, we've had a pretty foundational, stable, reliable system of medical bioethics. Right? Autonomy, beneficence, and justice are the three principles that guide all medical bioethical decision making since Nuremberg. Right? And it's a good framework. Right? Autonomy comes first. Individual informed consent, choices, right? And empowering those choices. Beneficence, do no harm. Right? And I think that's where some challenging decisions come in. And I think if you're providing people with unreliable information about those embryos, you're doing harm.
Right.
Right. So the scientific validity of the information you provide is primarily important, and that's our responsibility. Right. Individual parents make choices. Our responsibility is to empower those choices and to provide accurate information for them to make those choices on, and accurate information about the limitations of what we can do as well, right? So that they're truly informed when they make those decisions. And justice is the challenging part, right? Like IVF is not accessible today to nearly as many people as could benefit from infertility care. By making it work better, faster, we hope to contribute to improving that access challenge, and that's how we view our role, as improving the justice of IVF over time. But what you say about norms is correct, right? Have you watched the movie Joy on Netflix?
No.
So this movie, it just came out on Netflix, called Joy. It's about the first IVF baby, Louise Joy Brown, who was born in the UK in 1978. Yeah.
78.
And it's the story of scientific discovery of medical innovation that led to her birth. But the public controversy around the idea of playing God and making a baby outside the human body, right? They're like, these people, God has made them infertile. Who are we to change that, right? But the same principles, right? It's not up to you to decide. It's not up to God to decide. It's up to those individual parents to decide, is this a journey we want to go on? Is this important to us? Is this something that we want for ourselves? Right? And in those early days, right, the success rate was, it took years and years and years, and so many people tried in the course of that experimentation and failed to have a baby. And but each of them, with the knowledge of the journey that they were on, and that it might not be helping them, that it might be helping a future person, that participation in research, that ability to choose for yourself. I'm willing to take this risk because it's important to me, or it's important to the future, or it's important to people like me. However you want to make that decision, it's your decision, right? And beneficence, were they helping those people? Were they doing their best to minimize harm? They were. And then justice is do the people who, in that case, bore the risk of those interventions benefit from the discovery? And it's the same principles that guide these decisions if you're making them coherently and ethically, then as now. And the objections that people will raise to the genetics of embryo selection are the same as the people who would raise objections to IVF itself in the first place. We have that set of ethical principles that we adhere to, and that forms the core of how we build what we're building and how we offer what we're offering to patients. And that's that's not ours to make up. It's just ours to pay attention to and to care about and to think about deeply. So
no, I loved a thoughtful response. I realized I was talking to a lawyer.
Right.
I'm probably actually a better bioethicist than I am a lawyer at this point, thanks to having Carolyn, our co-founder, who's so brilliant on this stuff, and how long it's been since I practiced law. But yeah.
Carolyn is fantastic, our co-founder, and she very much, I think, guides us importantly in just having the conversation, right? You can tell that internally people are thinking about it deeply.
Right.
I also think it's important to, you kind of mentioned the norms, continue having the conversation externally so that we are kind of engaged in some amount of humility and really thinking through, what are we doing? Does it make sense? But again, with those guiding principles. I think what I'm most proud of is there is an answer for that, and you can tell people are thinking about it deeply and want to have the conversation.
Yeah, and when you think about helping with the selection process of embryo based on a few things, right? So what is does it have to be more of a like a must-have things? Like you want to make sure when baby is born, baby doesn't have any genetic disease, or because the main conflict around like eugenism, what's the term for that? Eugenics.
Yeah.
The main the public sentiment about not IVF. IVF is pretty well accepted because of the positive impact, but when you help pick the right embryo, is it always based on disease condition and the success rate after implantation? Or what are those things, right? On what basis you help the selection?
So I think we're looking basically at three pieces.
Okay.
The first two are very much related to embryo viability. And so the success of the transfer. And that is looking at the chromosome number, which is sort of traditional. The second is what we're bringing that is new to the space, which is looking for additional mutations that might be associated with embryo viability. The third is we are looking for inherited genetic diseases and would report those. We've had these conversations internally as well. So as an example, there are some genetic diseases where, like Tay-Sachs, right? Those babies really don't do very well, and it is a tragic condition, and they often die as children, and that is a really challenging thing to go through as a parent. So that's where it gets sticky. Like, would you actually transfer an embryo with Tay-Sachs? I don't know that you'd find somebody who would do it.
A doctor who would do it, or a parent who would do it.
Yeah, but I think you'd be challenged to find somebody who would transfer an embryo that you knew had Tay-Sachs. But then there's some things that are maybe a little more nuanced or gray. So for example, in the testing that we've done, we have identified a family where the mom has an ATM mutation. And you can see it in about half of the embryos. It makes sense. She's passing that down to her embryos. ATM mutations, when they are inherited just one at a time, are associated with an increased risk for cancer. It's not like a huge risk, but it is increased compared to the general population. Mom has that risk, and now they know potentially these embryos may have that risk. I think it's reasonable with counseling. They could very well decide to transfer those embryos. This is an adult onset risk. It's not 100% guarantee that you will get cancer. You're talking about having a child and their risk being increased 30, 40 years from now. But I can also see a family, depending on what that woman's family history is, if she's experienced a lot of cancer and maybe people passing away in her family because of cancer, you could reasonably see her making a decision like, you know what, I want this to end with me, and I don't want to transfer those embryos.
So in the next decade or so, you think we will allow fixing those genetic discrepancy?
Ooh, like gene editing.
Yeah. So here's the thing about that is that anything that you understand well enough to fix is much cheaper and easier to screen. Way easier, simpler, safer, more reliable to screen an embryo for those things. And anything that we could correct, anything we understand well enough to correct, we understand well enough to screen. There's literally no non-overlap of that set.
No, makes sense. We can take a break in a bit too.
Sure.
So it's a two-stage process, right? First, number one goal is that after implantation, it's a successful attempt, and then the other goal is that after the delivery, baby is healthy. Would you say these are the two clear objectives?
I think that the second one is a little more challenging, right?
Right.
You can screen for certain things. We are offering some of that information.
Okay.
And so we do want to be tracking in the long term the outcomes of the live births from Juniper testing for a number of reasons. But yes, one of those is to see, in the long term, what are the health outcomes.
The ideal state of that second set is free of known genetic disease, but it's very much secondary. For IVF clinicians and patients, the primary is, are we going to have a successful transfer, a successful pregnancy? And that's where embryo genetics plays such a large role, right? There's hardly any environment, and that's where we can have the biggest impact by generating the most data about those embryos that anybody's ever generated and using that to help inform that transfer decision.
One goal at a time,
That's right.
Exactly.
Make sure it happens.
Yeah, and let's start with the fundamental piece that is the most important piece for clinicians and patients in that moment.
This video is sponsored by SciSpot. At SciSpot, we are on a mission to turn every life science lab into an AI powerhouse. We empower these labs with our data infrastructure, so all of their R&D data is in one place and AI ready.
And so as you age, there is an increasing likelihood that there would be a chromosome abnormality, and then therefore a decreasing likelihood that you will become pregnant.
Right. And so this is the data gap that exists in infertility too, is that chromosomes are easy to measure. Right? So we have all this data on the declining female infertility, the increased rate of aneuploidy, chromosomal abnormalities as women's eggs get older. But a 45-year-old dad is contributing twice as many genetic variants to their embryos as a 25-year-old dad.
Right.
But we haven't been looking at that type of variation in pregnancy risk until very recently, and developmental risk until very recently. It's only as we've started to do higher resolution genetics, whole genome sequencing, whole exome sequencing, that we start to recognize this paternal contribution. So like the narrative follows the data, right? And generally speaking, couples are sort of moving around in the same age bracket, right? Women sure are older when they're having their first kids. The men they're conceiving those kids with are also older than they used to be. And both of those are creating genetic risk. And so, egg freezing is like invasive and expensive, right? But there's still more women doing that than men doing sperm freezing.
Right.
Which is cheap and easy.
Probably do both.
Right. Like, so yeah, I mean, if you are a woman who's thinking about freezing your eggs, talk to your male friends or male partner and freeze eggs. Or if you have a male partner, freezing an embryo is actually more reliable in terms of the likelihood of a successful pregnancy outcome than freezing sperm and eggs separately.
This happens every day in these clinics versus the movie we were talking about with Joy. It was a controversy and now it is commonplace and it is available, and we're just trying to make it that much better.
Makes sense.
Yeah. And I mean, I think, and we can't take it for granted, right? The legal change in Alabama that bestowed rights of personhood on embryos, and like overnight, every single IVF clinic in Alabama shut down, and there was massive backlash against that because people are, even strangely, like even more in favor of IVF than they are in favor of abortion care, even though the same ethical principles underlie both decisions. It's the exact same. Like to say, IVF good, abortion care bad is rampant hypocrisy. Right? It's morally indefensible. But still, like the reaction to that and the fact that a law could pass in the first place that granted personhood to embryos, right, it immediately decimated the practice of IVF and put people's frozen embryos in jeopardy in Alabama. And so, yeah, I mean, I think, we took abortion rights for granted as, settled law in the U.S. for 50 years. And here it isn't. So I think, we can't be complacent about the current state of the legal conversation. I think we have to be vigilant and active and vocal.
Right? It will give people more flexibility to have kids whenever they want.
I think it gives them flexibility. What is still missing, and I think Jeremy touched on earlier, is accessibility.
Yes.
So in a few states in the US, there are insurance mandates to cover IVF. And then there are a handful of companies, private companies, that provide coverage for IVF through the company's health insurance benefits. But for the most part, IVF is not widely available and it's not covered by insurance. And in fact, even the genetic testing we're talking about that improves the likelihood of that successful transfer is often not covered by insurance.
Even in Canada?
Especially in Canada.
Okay.
Although interestingly, like the Ontario government made an announcement a few weeks ago. So in Ontario, the way fertility coverage works is not part of OHIP coverage. Infertility care is not part of general public payer coverage in Canada. But the Ontario government has historically provided a certain number of funded IVF cycles to the general population of Ontario, and those are distributed among the IVF clinics in Ontario. The wait for those cycles tends to be very long. And as Kayleen said at the beginning, right, your age is a factor. Time matters in infertility. Like the length of your infertility journey doesn't just matter for your own emotional, financial state. It matters for the actual biology, the outcomes. So that wait time has been very long, which is a piece of inequity in itself. But the Ontario government just announced they're increasing the number of funded cycles. And interestingly and uniquely, what they propose to do, and we'll see how the actual implementation of this comes out, but to provide a tax benefit for infertility treatment, where patients themselves, instead of the funded cycles that are administered through the clinic, IVF patients themselves will be able to access this tax benefit, presumably, to choose what they're spending that on. And so it's going to be a different structure than the mandated coverage in the U.S. states as well, where you have a set of benefits that are provided and other structural things about U.S. insurance coverage. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out in Ontario, how patients choose to spend that money, because in the private pay system that's in the U.S. now, there is inequity, but there's also a lot of autonomy, right? Yes. You will often see in the press in the UK or in Europe, complaints about the cost of IVF in the United States, the number of add-ons, like the number of extra treatments that are offered to patients in the U.S. And unfortunately, because people who are trying to have babies are desperate to have babies, there is a lot of snake oil that gets sold in the IVF business. And because we don't have the data on genetics, it's very hard even to distinguish meaningfully which things are really snake oil and which things aren't, because the embryo itself might not be viable in the first place. So there's a lot of missing data, there's a lot of desperation, there's a lot of stuff that gets sold to IVF patients that they don't need. For sure, there is opportunistic product development and wasteful spending in IVF in the US. And the success rate of IVF in the US is much higher than it is in the UK and Europe.
Why is that?
And even in Canada. Because among the range of things that are available are things that really, really work. Like embryo genetic testing, which has had the single biggest impact on per transfer success rates and shortens your IVF journey already. And so if we can improve that, we know that we're providing something that's really meaningful for IVF outcomes. By providing that, we know that we're providing something that's going to be really meaningful for IVF outcomes. But the opportunity to access that outside of a regulated environment where the HFEA in the UK, the Human Fertilization Embryo Authority, says we don't recommend PGTA because if you have 5 embryos and you transfer them all, you'll find the viable one eventually. Good luck, right? Which completely ignores the experience of the patient going through IVF, right? But from a payer perspective, a national payer perspective, it costs the UK coverage system the same amount either way, basically, right? It doesn't because they pay for failed transfers, but the overall outcome is the same. So like, how can we justify this spending? How you can justify this spending is it makes the journey shorter and cheaper and less agonizing for patients. And when you give patients the option of choosing it in the US, they choose it and they succeed at a higher rates. So you can't, you can't separate you may not like every choice that everybody makes when you give them that choice. But if you don't give them that choice, if you try to impose these choices on people, you're harming them and you're harming overall outcomes.
Also, it doesn't make sense to provide coverage and then not cover the testing, because ultimately, yes, if you just keep trying and you keep transferring, at some point it will work. But the emotional experience, as Jeremy mentioned, of that is really challenging, and some couples drop out. So if you went into that treatment and it's being paid for and funded, and the goal of it was to help a couple have a child, you did not achieve your goal because you made the experience so bad that the couple opted out.
That's right.
100%.
And even when payment is covered, like there's a study in France, like even when payment is covered, patients still drop out. It's not all financial; it's the emotional burden of it. And I mean, there is also a direct financial benefit too. Like when private equity firms buy IVF clinics in the U.S., they use more embryo genetic testing because transfers aren't free. They use clinic resources and they cost patients about $5,000 every time you try a transfer. So you might pay more for testing, but you pay less for transfers, right? Your clinic can use its operating room to see new patients instead of to transfer more unsuccessful embryos to existing patients. They can use their lab to do more fertilizations and fewer embryo thaws and retrievals. Like the whole system works better. That if you can help people succeed on individual embryo transfers, you're helping them emotionally, you're helping them financially, you're helping them ultimately succeed because their journey is shorter. And you're helping the clinic and you're helping the payers. This opportunity is to really align everybody in the IVF space.
100%.
these
Even
outcomes.
if you, it's not the direct, it's more comparison. So when you develop a drug, you have to screen millions of drug candidates to bet on right candidates, like who has the most potential to become a cure for cancer, right? Which drug candidate can really cure Alzheimer's disease? So you have to screen them sooner than better, right? You want to do all the screening in silico these days too, combined with wet lab experiments. So you can bet on right candidates because you don't want to fail when drug hits the clinic, right? Because it's very expensive. You already spent a few $100 million. But in this case, it's not just about the cost. It's not a few $100 million, but it's more human emotional cost, right? There is quite a bit load on humans' emotional feelings, and people give up. So I do see some comparison between both the journeys, but very different.
Well, and if you really want to extend sort of that emotional journey, you can imagine if you're going through that as a couple, how that affects you at work.
Yes.
And you're also maybe leaving work for treatments or those types of things. And then the agony, especially as a woman, right, of going through that treatment and then perhaps not becoming pregnant. And then you're just supposed to show up at work like nothing happened, is really hard. And to do that over and over and over again
100%.
Is, there's something there. I don't know that you can put like a dollar amount. I'm sure somebody could put a dollar amount on it. But that matters as well.
Yeah, I mean, you don't have to just like be a human and think about it for a second, right? Like
Humans are emotional. That makes us special.
There's a CFO somewhere who wants to remember on.
I went to law school at University of Chicago. Like, there's nothing I like better than a good economic argument. But of course, you can do the health economics of this. It changes actuarial outcomes. It changes like all kinds of stuff on measurable productivity, which is why there is this alignment. Like if private equity and patients are doing the same thing, there's something real there. Like that's a real thing. And that's why embryo genetic testing has been so successful. In this
Love it. I do want to go deep, understand what makes your test special. Right? What exactly, like what is the process? what point of time in IVF journey you collect the sample, what exactly you do with it, what is the final deliverable to patients or parents in this case. So if you don't mind going through
So we discussed earlier the amount of genetic testing or kind of the amount of data that we are able to produce is really what makes us unique. In terms of how we get that data, the testing we're doing and the timing at which we're doing that testing on the embryo is exactly the same as the testing that occurs currently. So Jeremy mentioned earlier, you are making embryos day 5, day 6, day 7, you're taking a biopsy of just a few of those cells, and that is what we are able to do the testing on. Only the difference is traditional testing is looking only at chromosomes. So let's imagine your chromosomes are like a series of books. You have 46 books. It's easy to look at those books on your shelf and count them up. Be like, one is missing, or why do I have 47? That's odd. What we're doing is literally opening every single book, reading it from cover to cover. And we're looking to see, are there any other additional changes there that might matter for that embryo's viability? The other thing we're doing, and that is a little more unique, is something that's common in pediatrics, but we're also testing the parents. The reason that matters is that we need to know from the biological parents, what does their genetics look like? Because remember, we're looking at the book, and sometimes you find changes that are brand new. Those are suspicious because now you know you have an embryo with a change, maybe in a gene that's important for viability, and you're not seeing it in the parents. But also sometimes you see very minor changes, like if you think of the word gray. We could spell it G-R-E-Y. We could spell it G-R-A-Y. Does that matter? And having the genetics of the parents really helps us sort that out.
Love it. Love the analogy too. So you have this biopsy sample from embryos, then from parents as a blood sample?
Correct.
And what type of tests or what type of assays you're running on both samples, and how do you combine the data and create more reports, like a final deliverable?
Yep. So the final deliverable for the embryo, we are looking at the whole genome and the transcriptome. So if you imagine the book is like an instruction for like baking a cake or something, we're looking at the actual like protein or cake, if you will, to make sure that that is as expected. For the parents, we are looking at the whole genome of both. But ultimately, what you're getting on a report is very simple. We're taking all of that and we're saying, here are your 5, 6 embryos. Here are the chromosome results for those embryos. Here are whether we found any variants or changes in the genes that we're concerned about with respect to embryo viability. And then there's another column that says, here's whether there are any known genetic disease variants in that embryo. So we're trying to take a very complex set of results, but boil it down to something that ultimately is helping the provider and the couple decide which embryos to prioritize for transfer.
So this whole genome sequencing, this transcriptome analysis, that's basically RNA analysis. Our whole genome is more DNA analysis.
Correct.
So, right? And then for parents, what type of test you're running?
Just whole genome.
Just whole genome sequencing. And then in the final report, what type of insights you provide?
Yeah. So again, the bottom line is that clinicians and patients really, they're trying to just answer a very straightforward question, which is, I have 5 embryos, which one should I transfer? Which one is going to succeed in
They just want to make a decision.
Right?
Yeah.
They don't care about the data.
I mean,
we provide it all, but ultimately, when we're talking to providers, they care about that first page.
They care about the first page. Right?
So that they can make that decision.
Like, please just show us which embryo to transfer, because that's the decision, that's a clinical decision they're trying to make. And so, we want to support that with counseling. We support it with, the report is going to be voluminous. So, and we try to do this in a staged way, right? So the first page just gives you the very straightforward output, and then the next page will tell you like an overview of each embryo, what we found in each embryo. And generally, one of the things that's prevented people from innovating in this space is that the fear that the more data you generate on an embryo, the more you're going to disqualify embryos, right? Oh, if you do the whole genome sequence of an embryo, every embryo is going to have something that's like too scary. You're never going to transfer any embryos. You're going to but we're all sitting here, right? That can't be, it's not biologically true, right? There are viable embryos. We know the frequency of those viable embryos. So our job is to make those determinations, and it's new. Like that ability to curate all this information, to annotate that information in a way that makes an accurate determination of which embryos are viable and which ones aren't. Like this is the work of like a lot of smart people over an extended period of time at Juniper that you know is going to be continuously ongoing as we gather more and more embryo data over time. But at the end of the day, they just want that very straightforward answer of like, is this a viable embryo or not? And then the job of the rest of the report is to provide the context and the rationale behind the decisions that we're making, to be able to explain to them mechanistically, here's what we found, here's why we think it might impact viability, here's what we found, here's why it's classified as disease causing, right? So that patients and clinicians, it's part of the trust that's so important in this process, right? It doesn't help if sort of we hand wave and they don't understand why, or it doesn't connect to what they believe about why embryos are viable or not. It has to be, you know, it has to be rationally explained and connected. And that's the job of the rest of the report. That's the job of, you know, genetic counseling. That's the job of, you know, our whole team in a way is to create that decision point backed by rigorous science and rational explanation.
Makes sense. If there are more than one viable embryos, do you take side? You say, we would bet on this?
No.
No? You just say there are two viable embryos?
Yeah. So yeah, right. So I mean, parents might choose to prioritize an embryo that doesn't have a disease variant over one that does have a disease variant, even though they're both viable embryos, right? But no, beyond that, we're not. There's no score. There's no ranking. You know, to try to do that beyond the level that we have a genetic understanding of would be it would be a breach of trust, right?
It'd just be irresponsible.
It'd be irresponsible. Yeah, it would be a disservice to patients.
No, I was thinking in a different way. I was like, if there are 5 embryos and you say, I would bet on only this one, even when 3 other are viable, these babies will have to thank you. Like, thank you for picking me. Thank you for picking me. So, but yeah, no, makes sense. It's very unbiased, very data-driven, and you just share your findings. And then probably clinics work with parents and help them make the decision. So you're basically empowering clinicians, and then clinicians are working with parents. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
There is also genetic counseling available to those parents. So if the clinician, you know, maybe wants them to pursue additional information or have a more comprehensive discussion, that clinician, these are people who specialize in treating infertility. They're not specializing in genetics. So we do want to offer genetic counseling as an additional service, so everybody's on the same page and can really get the information they need to make the best decision for themselves.
Makes sense. And I want to talk about the business model a little bit. Like, it's a very sophisticated, complicated business, right? You have to work on the technology. Then you have to worry about ethics, which is a good thing. And you thought about ethics from day one. It's very impressive. Generally, it's afterthought because companies don't know how they're going to survive, and they come to a more ethical part later. But in your case, it was day one. Then now more counseling, genetic counseling element, working with clinics. So, like, how do you start a business like that? so many different pieces coming together.
I mean, in a sense, the answer is like naively or stupidly, I guess, depending on your perspective. But I mean, that's always the case, right? When we start, right? We, you know, I'm sure it was the same for you. We have a vision of what the future looks like, and it's compelling. And we go down the road, and like by the time we figure out how hard it's going to be, it's sort of too late. And
you're stuck.
We're all committed to it.
Yeah.
But it's worth it, right?
It's worth it.
That's
totally
the
worth
thing,
it.
right?
Yeah.
As you end up talking to the clinicians or you hear from patients, right? Like what a difference this would make. And so then
that's what
all
keeps
the
you
hard
going.
work makes sense.
Right. I mean, it must be the same thing for you. Like, you know, and I know we're not supposed to talk about SciSpot, but like SciSpot is part of the toolkit that really enables us to do this and to focus on the science, right? Is that, you know, it's one of the pieces that massively reduces operational complexity for us. Most of the embryo testing labs we talk to, we say, what do you use for limbs? Like, oh, we built our own limbs. Like, oh my God, if we were doing that on top of what we're already doing, like we would never be where we are today on the amount of capital that we've raised. We'd be, you know, way more diluted, or we'd be way slower. Like the ability to take a tool like SciSpot and just, hey, we have a functioning limbs and it interacts with all the other systems that we need it to talk to. And, there's a fantastic engineering team supporting it. And like, it's an incredible accelerant for us. And the same thing is true on the genetics lab space. I mean, even I was looking at, pitches from a year ago about what we thought our next financing would be like. And like it included a massive CapEx for building our own genomics lab. And in the intervening time, like the genomics infrastructure has improved to the point where it's almost like cloud infrastructure. We spoke to 4 different clinical genetics labs that are capable of doing the wet lab part of our assay. That's not where the secret sauce lives, but it's a critical piece. You can't do it without it, and it's specialized technical expertise, right? So that ability to just, the classic startup of like build versus buy, like the ability to have these amazing tools like SciSpot, like our partners at Aramid who are going to be doing the genomics lab, like it creates this unbelievable opportunity for us to focus in the same, like back to the original conversation, top of practice, right? Like it lets us do the stuff that's unique to us, that like solve the problems that are unique to us. And a lot of those have been scientific challenges up till now, and we've de-risked a massive amount of that with our initial data set. Now we have like massive operational challenges, even with all these tools available. It's still like there's a ton of stuff to solve, and it's hard. And part of why it's hard is because we have to make it seamless and easy for clinicians and patients. It has to be what they're used to. It can't disrupt the clinical workflow. It has to deliver the information that they need in the way that they need it. And if you try to, mess with that, or you make them scared about what they're going to get or how it's going to work, and this is why ethics is foundational too. Like, are they going to have to be ashamed or hide this? Like, is this something they can tell their colleagues about proudly? Like, IVF is a small community. There's only a few thousand practicing IVF clinicians in the U.S. Right? They all talk about this stuff. They all know who you are. They all know the people that they can trust and the people that they can't trust and the people they want to work with and the people they don't want to work with. And like, you have to be on that first list,
right?
And you have to build and maintain that trust. And that's the complexity of our job. And that's like why we're so lucky to have people like Kayleen and Danny and Carolyn, everybody, Adam and Charles and Grayson, like all the people who we brought on board and all of our advisors who help us with these decisions every day, and our investors who guide us down this path. Like, we've been really, I want to say lucky, but I think that it's more than that. I mean, we have absolutely, oh my God, we've been so lucky in every step along the way, including having friends and family to support the start of a business. Like, most people don't get to do that.
100%.
So really grateful for that. But also, I think, like, deliberately being scientifically rigorous, being ethically thoughtful. Like, I don't think you would be here if you didn't trust that we were doing those things from the beginning.
Yeah.
Right. And the same is true for our advisors and our clinical partners and everybody's involved in the company. Like, that's just, you can put a lot of things up on a wall about culture. But if you don't really live it, it doesn't matter what you say.
100%.
Right? You know this too, and you've been through this, and we've all been through this. Like, we learned, it's not like we learned it the easy way, right? We learned it by watching a bunch of people do things we didn't like and be like, oh God, I don't want to do that again.
Yeah.
And then by making a bunch of mistakes ourselves and being like, oh God, I don't want to do that again either. And like, so it's hard.
No, 100%. And thank you. We appreciate the partnership and your trust a lot. Thank you for saying that. But I really liked what you said, basically focusing on your sweet spot, right? To run, or start and scale this complicated business where you have so many moving parts. You can only make it work without burning hundreds of millions of dollars, is by be more strategic about where to invest your resources, right? What to build versus what to buy. You want to delegate everything that's not your sweet spot. Right, so you want to invest more in your core technology, your core models, your core offering, the whole experience by connecting the dots, rather than trying to reinvent the wheel. I do see hundreds of companies making mistakes. They get too excited about building things from scratch, even when they know they will never be best at it. Right, so you want to only focus on your domain of power. If you want to grow faster, right? If you do everything, there is some percentage of chance you can still make it work. But if you focus on your strengths, you are unbeatable in a way, if that makes sense. But I really appreciate the answer.
No, agree. I mean, it's the one thing I've learned working at startups is when you spread yourself too thin and you start doing the things that you probably just should have bought from somebody else because you thought for whatever reason you could do it better or cheaper or whatever. It's not better or cheaper. You've spent your time, and even if it's not actual capital, you've wasted time where you could have been focused on something much more important that makes your company unique. And I've been in companies where we got distracted.
And AI is not helping in a way either, because AI is making building new things very easy, even if you are not domain expert. But you build things, but you have to maintain it, right? AI is not helping with that. So you can build a lot of things, but then you want to keep things updated, maintain it, improve it. And that's very expensive process, even when AI is making things building super easy. And it's true for labs too. I think leveraging more labs in a more distributed model is a very smart approach. Most modern companies we work with, they have deep partnerships with collaborative, like network of labs. But they still have their own wet lab for something, their secret sauce, right? Something proprietary to them. But if they're doing some basic screening work, that can be done by any lab. They rather let it be done by people who are specialized doing this every day for many other customers.
Yeah. Well, and the millions of dollars it costs to buy the space, to have the sequencers, like it is
a huge CapEx.
Huge.
Yeah, 100%. What do you think is the future of this labs? We are seeing this trend. Labs are becoming more. We will wrap it up in like 5-6 minutes. Like labs are becoming more distributed in nature. Labs are becoming more computational in nature, right? So, like AI historically, or computational piece historically has been focused more on like a final stage of experimentation, meaning when you have to do analysis. But now most bio companies, AI diagnostic companies, they are using AI as a starting point in many cases. For example, in drug discovery world, companies are investing heavily on AI to design it properly or to shortlist candidates even before they enter the wet lab, right? So what they do is they have some computational piece. They start as a computational bio company and delegate all the wet lab stuff to CRO and academic partners. And when they understand where is their sweet spot when it comes to wet lab, they build their own lab, but for very specialized tech. But they always have this network of partners. So are you seeing any change in trend, how bio companies operate when it comes to leveraging computational lab, dry lab, partner lab from academia, from CROs?
I can just agree with the trend. Like when I began in startups, I worked at a startup where our special sauce in many ways was the lab and what we were able to do in that lab and the automation in the lab. And it is amazing to me that even just in the short time that I've been working in this space, that we've already transitioned from like that being the thing that could set you apart to, you know, when I was speaking with Jeremy, but also speaking to other people in the space and kind of looking for like what would be my next thing, talking to multiple people who were like, oh no, I'm thinking about, well, we'll have a lab that multiple startups can just like buy time on sequencers or whatever. Right. So it's definitely all headed in that way where we've realized we don't all need to buy the multi-million-dollar Illumina sequencer. And can focus on, but that's amazing, right? That's happened in the span of what, like 10 or 15 years, which is fast.
Massively accelerated. Yeah, the absolutely the ability to do distributed wet lab work. It's pretty transformational, I think. And it doesn't always work, and it doesn't always work at scale, right? Like, I think about I had a friend at Ancestry for a long time, and like the amount of work that it took for them because none of the existing tools or systems could handle sample processing. Like even like regular sample tubes would melt at the speed that they had to process them to process the millions and millions of people who were sending in Ancestry samples. Like the volume just exceeded the capacity of existing equipment, and they had to redesign tubes and equipment and workflows. And like there is like, if you're doing something completely unique or doing it at a unique scale, I mean, you have to. It's not a static decision, right? It's never a static decision. Right? You have to constantly reevaluate this stuff. And I think, where I've fucked things up, it's always been, I had an idea based on what I knew at the time, and I forgot to actively re-examine that idea as often as I should have.
Yeah, I mean, we all do that.
Like seek out dissent.
Yeah, like right, farm for dissent, seek out dissent, right, cultivate disagreement.
Yeah, I wanna wrap it up with fun part. More rapid fire questions.
See how fun this is. Fun for who?
Fun for who, Guru?
Fun for who? That's a good point. Yeah, we will find out in 5 minutes. So I'm going to ask some rapid questions to Jeremy first, and then I'm going to ask you, Kaen. Alrighty. So what other biotech companies are you following, and why are they exciting to you?
Oh, that's a great question. So, I mean, obviously, I'm closely following stuff in the IVF space. Right? So I think that there's a group of companies that is doing really interesting things in vitro gametogenesis. So right now, the hardest part, the most invasive part, the most expensive part of IVF is retrieving eggs. Right, the limited biological supply of eggs in a woman's ovaries. You have to do hormone stimulation. Anyway, so rapid fire, sorry. There's companies that are trying to make eggs and sperm from stem cells.
Awesome.
Super interesting. I don't know how far we are from that, but when we can do that, transformational for assisted reproduction. So very interested in these.
Meaning you can take skin sample from someone, undifferentiate them, create more like stem cell, and then transform those stem cells
again,
to
with
egg.
Consent, don't just go like scraping people on the street.
I'm not going to take skin sample without asking.
But yeah, like gameto, conception bio, paterna bio. There's some really interesting. I'm sure I missed a few, but
sure.
There's some companies doing really interesting stem cell work in this space, powered by AI and LLMs to understand the developmental biology of stem cells in really cool ways. So
love it. Yeah. If you could give your 25-year-old self one piece of advice, what would it be?
Professional advice?
Doesn't matter. Anything.
25-year-old me was really risk averse.
Lawyer.
I'm not even
Legal
a lawyer. I was still
not
like a
yet.
scientist in the lab. Like
Okay.
I was like on my way to I guess I was just starting grad school at the time. But yeah, I was really risk averse, and I think I would have wanted myself to make some of the risk transformation that's happened as I've gotten older sooner in my life. I think
Take more risks. Yeah.
I still have unbelievable privilege. Like there's a considerable family safety net that sits underneath me for every time I fall off whatever stupid tightrope I've decided to walk along at any given point in my life. And like I'm so fortunate to have that. And I've always, other people have more of it. Vast majority of people have way less of it. And I think that it's recognizing that gives me the ability to try risky things in my life without having to worry about having a roof over my head or being able to feed myself or feed my kids. Like that's a massive privilege, it's a huge advantage, and I didn't take advantage of it for a long time. Like it took me a long time to figure out that was a real power and privilege. So
yeah, I always tell people you always want to do things when you're not completely ready. You want to jump right in because you will never be completely ready.
And it's an opportunity to do risky, unsafe things and hopefully like change the world and leave it better.
Yes.
And like I wish I'd started that sooner.
It's more fun. If you had to explain your job to a 5-year-old, what would you say? See, I told you, it's fun.
When two people really love each other.
You can make a baby in a petri dish.
One of them goes into a surgical suite, and the other one goes into a closet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Liquid nitrogen cylinder.
Like the worst possible version of the birds and the bees. Yeah, I mean, we talk about trying to help people have babies who want to have babies and can't.
Love it. What is a biotech buzzword you never want to hear again?
Can I answer this one?
Yeah.
Sure.
If one more person says best in class, like I might die.
About state of the art.
Sorry. I'm ready on that one.
LIMS, Oh, no, wait.
I'm going to cut that out. Okay. If you could describe Juniper Genomics in 3 words, what would they be?
This is not fun. This is cheating because we went through a whole. But I think we're creating the future of fertility.
Yeah. What is one thing you do every day to stay inspired? It's a very tough business.
I talk to our team. Our team is amazing, and I'm so proud of the group. And I like, oh my God, I love working and talking to everybody. Like, what a joy!
Love
Holy
it.
shit. Yeah.
Love it. What's your ultimate vision for how genomics will transform human life?
I mean, genomics is
Genomics, and right now it's embryo selection. It's supporting that.
I mean, it's the recipe for human life. Like, and we're at a moment where, in this sort of weird inception way, like we're taking control of our own evolution.
I love that.
If we do that responsibly and rigorously and justly, what an amazing opportunity and what an incredible time we're in.
So playing God is okay as long as it's ethical, morally?
Well, so I mean, if by playing God you mean empowering your creations, then yes, right? Again, back to
100%.
autonomy. Right? Like there's no omniscient being here.
100%.
We just have to, we just have to let people make their own decisions and make sure that they're not coerced by government or economics or technology.
Right.
And if we do that, I think genomics can be an incredible force for good.
100%. I always say, playing God in quotes is it's our responsibility to find solutions to our problems, right? And genetics is the answer in many cases. So yeah. Alrighty. I'm gonna move to Kayleen now.
Yes, please.
If you could fix one major issue in the healthcare system overnight, what would it be?
Access and equity.
Love it. What book or paper changed your life and why?
This is a good question.
Or movie or any TV series or...
Real Housewives.
So, okay, this is so nerdy.
Okay.
When I was little, Jurassic Park was a big thing. And I remember reading the Michael Crichton book and just being blown away, right, by like the science and the DNA and like learning about all of that. So that probably has something to do with
That's awesome.
where I am now. That's the nerdiest answer on earth.
No, I love it.
I love that. Actually, we didn't do it when we were talking, but I often, when I'm interviewing someone, will start by just asking them like how they first became interested in science. So I did not know it was I did not know it was velociraptors for you.
I always thought that was cool.
That's amazing.
And then ultimately, I went to college maybe a little too early or to the wrong school, or I don't know. I thought that I wanted to genetically engineer, which you can do now, like organs for transplant. So I started as an engineer in school, but I was doing well, but just didn't love doing that, and pivoted and learned about genetic counseling, and here we are.
Love it.
Cool.
Love it. If you had to bet your entire career on one trend, can be biotech trend, What would it be?
I think it's just genetics in healthcare. There's just a ton of promise, and every day, right, there's some new discovery, there's some new company that maybe the company doesn't make it, but there's value in the science that brings to the table.
No, makes sense. If you could solve just one problem in IVF forever.
Equity and access.
Love it.
I mean, IVF in some ways is just sort of this microcosm of healthcare broadly.
Yes.
And so is genetics. Like you were listening last night to something, I think a genetic counselor said something about access to genetic counselors. And early on in my career, I thought like, oh, this is a major issue, access to genetic counselors. But what it is just, again, a microcosm of a larger societal
access to
issue.
healthcare expertise. Yeah.
I think this question is for both of you. What's a bold prediction you have for biotech in the next decade?
We're going to keep saying best in class now.
Whatever happens 10 years from now, we'll still be best in class.
That's true.
I'm looking forward. I don't know if it's a bold prediction because a lot of people have said it, but I continue to look forward to the time where we are able to, and we are close, I think in some ways, like sequence a newborn and then you sort of revisit or reinterpret that sequence throughout their lifetime and are making, relevant healthcare decisions
Will they have mobile
throughout
app?
that journey.
Juniper
right?
app?
Well, that was, I don't know if it's Juniper, Nest is sort of going down this road. Helix has previously gone down that road. The makings of it are there. We just haven't quite realized.
Yeah, I think it's one of the things, having been in the genomic space for a while myself now, is that we've always known that if you had your genome available at a whole pile of different care points, right, that data would be valuable. But it's been really hard to find a compelling time to generate that data where like it's cost effective, the benefit that you deliver in the moment of generating it it has the right value for people to choose it at scale. And like weird genomics nerdy way, it's one of the things that I'm excited about Juniper is that now what's the output of this, right? You've sequenced the embryo, you've sequenced the parents. Now you have a family who has their genome sequenced, right? And who's done it in an encounter where it was like transformational to an actual healthcare journey in that moment with emotional and financial value that justifies the investment in generating that data. Now we have it, right? So how can we partner, with companies like Nest or Nurture or like other people who are trying to utilize that data on a lifelong basis, Helix, whoever it is. But like, how can we work with those families and work with new companies where if you have a baseline of that data existing now, what's the potential for that down the line? And right now, those companies have had to solve both problems at the same time, which is really hard. So like, we're giving patients immediate value for generating that information.
Yeah.
And now, what's the lifelong utility of that data? It's going to be massive. So I think the more people are using assisted reproduction, the more people are using Juniper and having that data from the birth of their child, about themselves and the child. Now we have a lifetime of utility and better clinical outcomes driven by genomics, which is it's been the promise since the beginning of the Human Genome Project. But creating that value chain has been missing. So I think like providing that missing link and out in the world.
I think in software product, we face something very similar. Every time we launch a new product, we talk about instant gratification, basically giving value right away or as soon as possible. If you expect people to invest 2 years or 6 months just to see value, it's very hard to keep them engaged. Right. So, and I think that's true for every industry. How do you show them a value in some form sooner rather than later? So they're not going to sequence just because in 2 years they will be able to
make a drug treatment decision.
Yes.
Or yeah, I mean, first of all, who doesn't like instant gratification?
Yes.
Second of all, like, I mean, from the time we're like kids on Halloween, like everybody wants to open the candy. Of course
Yes.
of course we do. But even and especially in healthcare, right, where a lot of healthcare innovation is driven in the U.S., where payers don't consider even medium-term time horizons because people move between plans, they move between geographies. So if there's not an ROI from a healthcare intervention in 2 years, it's not going to happen. And so the long-term preventive care stuff that we really want from a systemic point of view is hard to develop. So you have to find hacks to generate that data in an immediately useful way that makes sense for payers, it makes sense for patients, it makes sense for clinicians in the moment. And if there's a way, that data then has long-term value
Yes.
that somebody can realize, that's the path to, I think, changing those long-term outcomes.
Yeah, hopefully in the next decade, we all have access to app to access all of our health data, like regular blood checks, but also our immune profile, our genetic profile, right? If we have access to our basically more the data that comes from our wearable apps, Apple Watch, if all the data is connected and on a daily basis, we are not just tracking sleep, we are going even at the deeper level and making better health decision, even what to eat, how much
That doesn't sound fun.
So, I think we will get there, but currently data is not connected.
Correct.
So,
well, and not just for you, right?
Yeah.
It's not connected because your health in the US, your health insurance changes or you move and the clinic changes. And so your records are all over the place.
Right.
And not linked.
Yeah, and not connected to one another. So even when I go to the doctor, that they don't have my records from the last place, and it's a whole nightmare.
Doctors are doing an amazing job, but in some cases it feels like they have to basically make a guess. In many cases, it's not necessarily data driven. It comes from their wisdom, their experience, but they don't have access to all the data.
Right. Well, and that's a piece of the puzzle, but there is, and I think we have to understand that while we want as much science as possible in medicine, there's also, back to where we started, some like art and just being human involved.
Yes.
I want to be respectful of your time because I only asked for 2 hours and we are already over time. So I really appreciate. I really enjoyed the discussion.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Likewise.
thanks for
Really
having us.
appreciate it. Yeah.
Yeah, always fun to chat. And you've got such a cool vision for the way the world is going. Really enjoyed it.
Likewise.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.